Hello and welcome to this week's Talking Africa podcast, where we get behind the news from the continent. I'm Anne-Marie Besada. Our weekly podcast is brought to you by the Africa Report magazine, which you can always check out online at theafricareport.com. When veteran correspondent Michela Wrong started researching her book, Do Not Disturb, the story of a political murder and an African regime gone bad on the killing of Rwanda's spymaster, Patrick Karegeya, she knew it was going to prompt fierce arguments about President Paul Kagame's record and the country's direction. What does Karegeya's turbulent life and traumatic death tell us about Rwanda's political dynamics, and why some of Kagame's oldest allies became his staunch opponents? In the special edition of the Talking Africa podcast, Patrick Smith brings together Michela Wrong and Kenyan writer and historian Parselelo Kantai to discuss the issues raised in the book for Rwanda and the wider region.
Maybe we could start with your first meeting with Patrick Karegeya, and what then really prompted you to think about him as somebody you would then write a book about?
I actually can't remember when I first met him. I think it wasn't, as you said, I went into Rwanda for the first time in July 94, so 3 months after the start of the genocide. Because I was a French-speaking journalist based in Kinshasa, and Reuters, my employer, said, there's Opération Turquoise going in. Can you go and cover them? Because your French will be useful. And so, I was touring around with a bunch of French journalists and sort of seeing the debris and the effects of the genocide. Lots of sort of buried bodies, lots of rooms in which you would go into, and churches where you could see that there had been a massacre because of the bloodstains on the walls and the smell, and the signs of desperation, people scrabbling to get out. So it was kind of really strange, haunting journey to be on. And of course, like most of the journalists, I had no hinterland. I didn't know the background to this story at all. I didn't really know who the RPF were. I think I had 3 or 4 pages of notes that I had photocopied in the Reuters office in Abidjan before going in. But you have to learn fast and you try. I then got very caught up in the whole refugee story, as all the Hutus streamed out of Rwanda as the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, were capturing power, and the Interahamwe and the Rwandan army and the Rwandan government just sort of herded everyone out of the country and into Goma and Bukavu and also into Burundi. And then that became a sort of massive refugee story, and it was hit by cholera. So there was a lot of time spent there. I probably met Patrick in October for the first time, October 94, when I went to help out with the Reuters bureau in Kigali. And he was this very suave, debonair, ebullient. He was the head of external intelligence, but you would have thought he was more like a press officer, in that he was the guy who was sort of sent to say hello to the journalists. Often when you were waiting for an interview in the lobby, an interview with the president, either Emmanuel and Ndahiro would come out, or it would be Patrick who would come out and chat to you. So I suppose that was the first. We didn't really connect in any particular way, but I think I sort of got to know him better as he became less and less successful, if we can term it that way, because the story really is the book of a man who goes from being a sort of, right at the top of this elite, with this very interesting background as to why he, as a Ugandan Rwandan, acquired that very important job as head of external intelligence. But it's also the story of someone who fell out with his boss with fatal consequences, and why he fell out with the boss. And a lot of that was quite personal, but also ideological. And so I think I got to know him better in that phase of his life, when I remember particularly going in one time, I had taken on a job as a consultant, sort of stroke guide for John le Carré, the thriller writer, also known as, real name David Cornwell. And I just we were going into Bukavu for the mission song, which John le Carré was writing. And I just thought, I knew that Patrick had been released from house arrest. He was very much, in disgrace. He was no longer Kagame's best friend. These were two men who'd been through everything together. They'd been to school together. They'd been in the bush together, but they were no longer, on speaking terms. And I thought it would be really interesting to introduce him to John le Carré. And Patrick was so disillusioned and so sort of bitter and jaundiced and upset at what had happened. And then later, of course, he went into later he served a prison sentence, went into exile after that because he was warned that his life was in danger, went to South Africa, moved there, and eventually set up an opposition party.
How did he get on with John le Carré?
I think David Cornwell was absolutely fascinated by him. I think they hit it off. Typically of Patrick was a very well-read man, so he had sort of probably read every book that John le Carré had ever written, more than me, I think. And John le Carré sort of was in his element because he'd met people like Patrick all his life, only their East European equivalents, the Soviet equivalents, their East German equivalents. So he knew the type, and he knew the kind of compromises that people like that have to make, and the intelligence and the sort of the unhappiness that sort of is often there under the surface, because these are very intelligent men who are doing things they're not necessarily that happy with. So it was a really interesting encounter. And I think John le Carré remained interested in that story afterwards. And I remember telling him that Patrick had been murdered. But anyway, to bring an end to that long story, the only reason I wrote this book is because the regime reached out and killed Patrick Karegeya. If it hadn't been for that, there would have been no book, because to me that was such a shock. And for one of the things it told me is like I'd sort of let a lot of things drift. I hadn't been following Rwandan events, and the fact that Paul Kagame could have sort of had this man who he'd been to school with, who they'd all been at the same weddings and funerals, they'd been at each other's houses, they'd drunk beer together, they trusted each other with their lives. That he could have had that man killed told you a great deal, it seemed to me, about where the RPF had reached by that stage. And then I thought, well, then you tell the story of how that can happen. That's a really interesting story.
Right. Parselelo, I mean, you know the RPF from lots of different angles. You spent a lot of time in Uganda. We've reported together as a team in Rwanda ourselves. Were you surprised by what happened to Patrick in the end? Could you see he was a guy who was, it was never going to end well? Somehow he was going to challenge Kagame and it was all going to end as it ended.
Well, first and foremost, I mean, I was until relatively recently, I was not very, very close as a reporter, as a journalist to the RPF story. Definitely not in the way that Michela, for instance, is, or older journalists in this region, the Charles Onyango Bose and others. I mean, they so one followed the story from a kind of remove that wasn't informed by the kind of close encounter that Michela is describing. It is later for me that let me say that I think my sense therefore of who the RPF was most I kind of developed that sense much more recently when myself and some colleagues were working on a kind of retrospective book called Who Killed Kabila? It was on the assassination of Laurent Kabila. And we were doing that with Chimurenga, the Chimurenga Chronic, which is based out of Cape Town. And we came together as a group of about 7 or 8 writers, filmmakers, and journalists, all from countries that neighbored the Congo. And the idea being that we were each going to do takes on how our countries got entangled in the Congo War. And the jump-off point was the assassination of Kabila. My remit, I mean, not only half being from a country that neighbored Congo, Uganda, that is. My remit was actually to do the kind of historical overview of the story, and the way I did it was to look at Laurent Kabila's political history, from the 60s in Dar es Salaam all the way to the moment when Patrick Karegeya shows up in his house in Dar es Salaam to pick him up.
Yeah.
So therefore, my relationship to this whole thing is, in a very weird way, historical, and looking at it and trying to go back and just join the dots was a very fascinating and rather terrifying experience, in the sense that at the same time I had interviewed Kagame, I had interacted with all these guys once they were in power, years after the genocide, and so the relationship was the relationship between a journalist and a kind of developmental state actor, rather than an ex rebel, who had led a force 4,000 kilometers
in the Congo.
Into the Congo.
Yeah.
But
I wanted
said all
to
that.
Yeah.
I'm still filled with questions about the actual nature of this movement, and quite a few of them have been picked up and answered in this book. But as we go on, I hope I'll throw in a lot of new questions just for clarification and illumination.
Yeah, no, please do, Parselelo. I mean, there's a question I wanted to ask you both, actually, and I think the book goes some way to answering it. Although it is essentially a book about Patrick Karegeya, it's also a book about the Rwandan Patriotic Front, whether one likes it or not. Maybe I can ask you both the same question. I ask you first, Michela, and then to Pasa. What is the Rwandan Patriotic Front? Where did it come from? I mean, we know physically and geographically it came from Uganda, and why it developed in Uganda the way it did, and why did it take over this country and do something very different from certainly any other country in the region, and few countries in the world have done. I wondered what your take on that is, Michela.
Well, I remember when I set out to write the book, the only thing I really knew about the roots of the RPF was that they came from the Ugandan refugee camps. That was what you would always hear, that this was a movement that had been born in the bitterness of the refugee experience of all these Tutsi aristocrats and their hangers-on who had been, ejected from Rwanda in the 1950s and 1960s and had sort of sat in these really quite grim camps waiting to return. And then those young men teaching themselves how to fight in the national resistance movement, that because they joined en masse, they joined the NRM of Museveni because they were like most disenfranchised, alienated, fed up youngsters, and there was a charismatic rebel leader called Yoweri Museveni. Let's join him, and some of them with this vision of we'll learn how to fight for our rights, and then maybe that will come in useful later. So I suppose I sort of vaguely knew that, but I think what was really interesting for me investigating is some very basic things I didn't know. For example, I didn't know that Patrick was not a refugee himself. He was part of that Ugandan Rwandan community that had been in what was later defined as Uganda for generations, and so had a choice, to become more Ugandan or become Rwandan. And what happened was that when Milton Obote began to victimize the Banyarwanda community in Uganda, a lot of young men like Patrick decided that since they weren't welcome, they were really Rwandan, and at that stage they joined this budding rebel movement. I think the other thing that was really interesting to me was to uncover, there's this whole debate going on in Uganda about, did Museveni know that within the heart of his NRM rebel movement, and then later within the army that was obviously built from that rebel movement in 1986, the National Ugandan Army, did he know that he had a secret rebel movement, the RPF? that they were sitting there like a kind of cuckoo in a nest, waiting to sort of burst forth from the body of Uganda and go into Rwanda. And, you hear, I mean, this is a constant preoccupation with Ugandans. If you speak to former NRM people, some of them will say, of course he knew, it was always a deal. And, he was going to help them go back to Rwanda and find their homeland once he'd seized power in Uganda. And other people will say, no, he didn't, because they were very secretive. And in fact, if you talk to former RPF guys, they will say, you had to keep it quiet. You'd have been shot if it had been known when we were in the bush, in the NRM fighting in Uganda, if it had been known that there was this sort of core of young Rwandans sort of planning their own organization, they would have been shot.
And was that because Museveni didn't want to offend the Habyarimana regime, or he just resented the idea that someone could build up a guerrilla movement without him being in complete control of it?
I think it was both. Firstly, if you're running a rebel movement, discipline is everything. I mean, and rebel movement or army, it's the same. It's all about top-down discipline. And you can't have little secret groups. That's very threatening. It undermines the unity of your force. Everyone has to be looking in the same direction. So this would have been regarded as a real threat to the cohesion of the NRM and then the Ugandan army. But there was also this fact that Museveni was for many years having talks with Juvenal Habyarimana, right. Because Rwanda under Habyarimana was providing the NRM with vital access routes. And this kept coming up. He kept saying, you're training, Habyarimana kept saying to Museveni, you are training the young men who are going to come and attack my country. And Museveni was saying, no, they're just part of our force. We recruit anybody. We're sort of ethnicity blind. And in the end, of course, Habyarimana was right. So, but yeah, I mean, even to this day, I don't think Museveni would ever admit that he knew that Fred Rwigema, the young charismatic head of the RPF, was going to cross over. I mean, for me, one of the great joys about writing this book was that I learned an awful lot, and I didn't know any of this. And I also had just a vague image of who Fred Rwigema was, and it was really interesting to discover what a charismatic and much loved personality he was, and how he's still kind of, he's still haunting the RPF, because I think there are people in the RPF who have romanticized him, and they feel that's the route they should have gone down.
He's not quite Che Guevara to Kagame's Fidel, but he's certainly more Che Guevara-like than Kagame is Fidel-like, I guess.
Well, I mean, because, of course, he would, had he lived, he would have been the boss, so he would have been the Fidel. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, he had some Che Guevara qualities. He was young, he was sexy. Every woman who met him fell in love with him. He could command instant loyalty. He had that feel for the common fighter. All of those, by the way, qualities that people will tell you Kagame does not have, never has had. But you
say in the book that Kagame didn't actually have the respect of many of the soldiers fighting under him.
Well, it's one of the many elements I would have liked to probe further, and one day I hope I will, because what you hear is that after Fred Rwigema was killed in these mysterious circumstances in 1990 on the second day of when the RPF had invaded Rwanda, that after Kagame came back from Fort Leavenworth, where he'd been doing a training with the US military, and took command of these troops that were in disarray because they'd lost not only their charismatic leader, but several of his second in commands, and then he moved them all to the mountains to sort of lick their wounds and recover, that there was a purge, and quite a nasty purge. And a lot of the commanders who had looked up to Fred, who were very experienced commanders, knew how to fight, they'd been sort of trusted right-hand men of Museveni, that they were either sidelined, in some extreme cases killed, or took mysteriously sick. But that basically the RPF was then reborn at that stage in Kagame's image, and the people who were promoted were the people he trusted. And there was this very strict disciplinary code was introduced with all sorts of things. Infractions were to be punished with the death sentence. And that the RPF changed at that point. And I think, that's one of that you will hear people often talking in these glowing terms now about Fred, because they sort of feel that the RPF that they joined and supported and sent money to and sent their young men to fight in was a different creature from what it became under Kagame.
Right. Thanks. Parselelo, yeah, can I get you first on the RPF question, just in terms of what sort of organization you think it is? And just, as a sort of supplementary on that, when you're talking about it, thinking about the issue that the most serious opposition Kagame has faced, particularly in the last 10 years, has been from this, well, maybe more than 10 years, in fact, from this close-knit band of fighters that was with him in the war against the Habyarimana, the remains of the Habyarimana regime, and part of this core of the RPF that Michela's just referred to.
I think historically, the way Michela locates Museveni's kind of revolutionary journey, or journey as a anti-Obote rebel revolutionary in 1970s Fronasa is pretty much where one, is a good place to begin as far as understanding what the RPF is. One of the questions that remains right on the table as far as the RPF is concerned, and Michela picks it up very well in the book, is this question of citizenship and nationality. At what point does the kind of Tutsi element, where does the Tutsi element within the NRM, not the RPF, begin, and where does the Ugandan element take over? And that merging, you find in Uganda up to this day this question of Banyarwanda and their citizenship in Uganda as a very, very loaded question. I think, if I'm not wrong, in 1980, during the 1980s election, which is another turnkey moment in the whole history of both the NRM and later the RPF. Museveni running in Western Uganda, need to check on the actual constituency, was running against Sam Kutesa, and Sam Kutesa campaigned on an anti-Rwandan, anti-Tutsi platform, which is to imply very, very loudly that question is faced by Museveni himself. On the streets of Kampala, the question will be, is he a Ugandan? Is he a Muhima, or is he a Tutsi, a Rwandan? Up until
you'll often hear that joke being made, won't you, when you're in Kampala?
Absolutely.
And you're chatting, and they'll say, well, he's not even a Ugandan. If they're being rude about Museveni, they'll say, oh, he's not even a Ugandan.
Well, in other circles, it gets far less funny, and people raise the question of and it's a question that you do bring up in the book, the question of split loyalties. Did Museveni encourage, as you were saying, the last point, did Museveni encourage and know about the RPF and the first invasion, or was he kept in the dark? And there are very few people who are going to buy the fact that maybe he didn't know, even though Michela, you really go into it in the book, turning it this way and that. But I think it still remains a question on the table.
Completely.
And it is a question of allegiances. What is this movement really?
How do you, when you look at the RPF, and historically you've looked at a lot of liberation movements across Africa and other parts of the world, Central America and so on, how do you assess it, Parselelo, what is it? Is it a revolutionary movement with a development program, or that all came later, bolted on? It's raw assertion of power.
That's a question right up my street, because what I'm looking at the moment is exiled revolutionary movements in Dar es Salaam, and they're mostly Southern African. The ones they're looking at, all the way from Frelimo to the South African ones to the Namibian ones, and so on and so forth. My kind of organizing question there is, what did Dar es Salaam do to these movements, or what did exile in Tanzania do to these movements? How did they feed into each other? Because we never get those kinds of social histories here. So that's what I'm diving into at the moment, and it's quite fascinating. But part of that cohort of revolutionaries, as self-proclaimed and otherwise, was the Ugandan contingent. And the Ugandan contingent, Museveni talks about it at length in sowing the mustard seed, but also in more recent interviews, he's gone into it, and he talks about his roots as a revolutionary in setting up the USAF. It was called the African Revolutionary, the Students' African Revolutionary Front, and one of my informants was one of the 5 other people Museveni first traveled with across the border to Mozambique under Samora Machel in 1969, and the way he talks about Museveni now. I'm sorry. It appears that I'm dwelling a lot on Museveni rather than his counterpart across the border. But I think this is where it all begins with these guys. Now, what my informant was telling me a few months ago when I was interviewing him was that they understood themselves as Marxist revolutionaries and Pan-Africanists. What he's saying now, 50 odd years later, is that he is ashamed to have ever been anywhere associated with Yoweri Museveni. This is what this guy says. His name is Salim Soma. Now, this was the basis. Dar es Salaam was the basis for exiled Ugandans after the toppling of Obote. Obote went and settled there. Museveni also returned there or stayed there, and they set up Fronasa. From my understanding, it was Fronasa that gave a kind of was the kind of laboratory into revolutionary ideology and military training for the likes of Rwigema and a cohort of others. So that's where it begins. There is an assertion by the Musevenis, especially in the early days, that they were Pan-Africanists, and that therefore they did not believe in these colonially bounded territories, that they would go wherever they needed to go to foment revolution and to liberate the places. And I think even much later you'll still hear the same guys, now considerably older and considerably more tainted, just kind of recalling that history, as kind of as defense of their old credentials. And if we're saying that is where the RPF began, and I'm also suggesting that from what I am picking up from my research for the Dar es Salaam book, is that a lot of people wonder today about the revolutionary credentials of Museveni and the Fronasa people. This is also
of the RPF.
Yes. Well, I think there's a staggered history that would be too involving to go into on this, because it would center more on the NRM and Uganda. Uganda's very, very vexed exile politics, and then liberation history, and then bungled 1980 elections, and then the Bush War. But the RPF is implicated completely inside the kind of how do you say, maybe the gestational period of the RPF's of the NRM's foundings. Fronasa and the whole attempt to unseat Amin becomes a kind of staging ground for what would happen a decade or so later with the invasion of Rwanda. But to the question of what exactly the RPF is, I mean, their official narrative is of a revolutionary liberation movement. But in actual practice, I mean, I think the history of Rwanda and the history of the Tutsi exiles tell a completely different story. This was an ethno-nationalist movement dressed up in revolutionary garb that was going into to evict the very people who had evicted them.
Yeah.
Whether or not there had been a genocide in 1994, that was always going to happen.
Exactly. I think that's true.
And I think one of the interesting insights that is in Mahmoud Mamdani's book is that the revolutionary councils, which were the sort of the units that Museveni used, when he was in the NRM in the Bush War, to educate the peasants, teach them about their rights, teach them the meaning of liberation and equality, and these very ideological kind of creations. There were none when the RPF went into Rwanda. They didn't try and set up revolutionary councils because they weren't there to preach revolution. They were there to capture power. So I would agree with Parselelo. I think it was a very different movement, but I suspect that they themselves weren't that clear on the difference.
So a lot of journalists, we covered the aftermath of the genocide in 1994, and at that time, everyone was giving the RPF full marks for ousting the Interahamwe, the remnants of the Habyarimana regime, and feeling, if they were Westerners, feeling pretty disgusted with their own governments for, in all sorts of ways, sabotaging any international effort to save hundreds of thousands of lives. So with that horror in our minds, it took a lot of people quite some time to reassess independently what was going on under the RPF government led by General Paul Kagame. Can you say something about that point in the book where you describe how you came to terms with the fact that this wasn't what you thought it was?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, there were a series of little warning signs that sort of send alarms going off in your head. But, Rwanda wasn't the only country I was covering as a journalist for the Financial Times, as it later became. And so you just sort of thought, that's interesting. That wasn't what I was expected. And then you moved on. I mean, the one of the early warning signals was the infamous Sony Report carried out by Robert Gersony, that US expert on human rights who had been sent by Sadako Ogata, the UNHCR director, to find out if it was safe for the Hutu refugees in eastern Congo, eastern Zaire, to go back home, and who instead discovered that no, at least 35,000 Hutus had been killed by the RPF. So no, it wasn't safe for them to go back home. And these were not just sporadic revenge killings. And that was kept secret, that report, but sort of everyone heard about it. I only saw it years later, but you sort of knew what was in it. And I remember thinking, that doesn't sound right. That's worrying, but surely, but also really questioning its credibility and thinking, everyone knew that the French, were playing a very malign role, that they were spreading this propaganda about the double genocide, that there had been a Tutsi genocide by the Hutus, sure, but that there had also been one by the RPF against the Hutus. And you sort of thought, well, who is this guy? Can it be trusted? So there were suspicions. The other warning signal, of course, was the massacre that took place at the Kibeho refugee camp, where in front of the cameras, up to, I believe it's up to 6,000, or is it 4,000? I'm afraid I can't remember the details. Hutu refugees who had been in the camp were killed by the RPF, which wanted those camps inside that area formerly controlled by the French. They wanted them disbanded. And they were utterly ruthless in how they broke up those camps. And they didn't care who saw them doing the shooting. So that was really very worrying. And then I think the final event was really Sesenda Shonga's flight into exile and eventually his murder, where you sort of think this is a Hutu, the former interior minister, a Hutu who had joined the RPF, taking a huge risk with his own reputation, a former opposition man, lots of following in the Hutu community, very intelligent, very motivated, and who just became convinced that the RPF were actually wiping out Hutus systematically. And I remember being at this press conference that he threw in Nairobi, in Chester House, where there's the press conference center, and him sort of with these reams and reams of telex paper covered in names of Hutus that he said had been killed by the RPF. And it was about 500,000 people. And I remember just thinking, this is not the narrative that we've been telling the world. It was a very familiar narrative to all the French journalists who were at that press conference, but it was certainly not what the Anglo-Saxon, Americans and Brits in the room were reporting. And just at that point thinking, I really don't know how to get my head around this story. I haven't been following it closely enough. I no longer know who to believe. And I suppose after that, when you began to hear these stories where former RPF officers were going public and saying, yeah, we did bring down Habyarimana's plane. We shot the rocket that brought it down. Yes, we were responsible for this. We were responsible for that. I moved from feeling that can't possibly be true to thinking, well, who knows? This was obviously a rebel movement, and now a government that has been capable of a great deal. So for me, that was the process. And I think, along the way, I think a lot of journalists went through that same trajectory, and maybe quite a lot of aid workers and diplomats. But then you always got the people who were sort of still chanting the song that they had sort of chanted in 1994. No, these people are amazing. This is extraordinary. They've rebuilt the country. They ended the genocide. My God, what extraordinary feats they have achieved. They deserve massive Western help. And they never, those kind of diplomats, aid workers, academics, never wanted to listen to the rest, these other voices.
The doubts. Parselelo, I wondered, one of living in one of the neighboring countries, as you do, what you made of others, journalists, aid workers, whoever, people who changed their view of the RPF, and what you see around you. I mean, do you think in the region people had a much more clear-eyed idea of what was going on in Rwanda than the outsiders? And how do you when you read Michela's book, how do you think she deals with those issues?
Good. Again, questions I've been asking myself as well. Throughout this kind of 25-year period is the extent to which, and maybe Michela can pick this up as well. The extent to which Western power as a whole, in that decade after the Cold War, basically intervened in this region, and created a couple of very kind of simple, powerful narratives about the region, picked a couple of straw men and ran with those stories. In the face of a reality that was diametrically opposed to that. So that Rwanda itself, and actually the Great Lakes and the whole, from the Rwanda genocide all the way into the Congo War, was actually a situation of competing realities. Some of them completely contrived, because here we. And by here I'm saying in Kenya, we had our own constructed realities about what was going on in Rwanda, especially because the Moi regime here was very close to the Habyarimana regime. Actually, there is a story that
sheltering to the extent of sheltering genocidaires, in fact,
and would later, as recently as last year. When a genocidaire was picked up, having lived here for decades, just tells you the extent to which we were complicit in protecting one side, and one completely murderous side against the Tutsi and the RPF.
Well, one of the things I find interesting is the emotional pitch of this debate. And I don't think there are many debates in Africa that people get so upset about and so uptight about. And you will hear, Westerners, whether diplomats or aid workers or journalists, you would think they had joined the RPF, when they were 5. They're arguing with a ferocity and a passion and a sort of depth of feeling, and I think that's what's really quite strange about the Rwanda story. There are these competing narratives, but people don't stand back and say, well, it could be this, but it could be that. It's either one or the other, and I think it's very interesting to try and examine why that is. And I think one of the reasons is guilt, the guilt that Westerners feel at having, withdrawn UN troops at the height of the genocide and only then gone back when it was almost, it was basically
it was too late.
I think there's a lot of echoes of the Holocaust story, and that has a lot of resonance, especially for Americans. And also maybe you've got a lot of Western religious leaders, whether they're rabbis or evangelical pastors, who sort of have been inspired, I think, for that reason. But and then you've got this whole development shtick going on, and development philosophy, which needs Rwanda to succeed and needs Paul Kagame's government to be seen as virtuous and an example and a model for the rest of Africa. And so all of those reasons mean that there's a huge emotional passion attached to wanting a certain narrative to win out. But I think it's almost this. Those are my explanations. But I do think there are still some other elements to it that explain it, because I find it very puzzling.
Parselelo, what do you think explains the? It appears if you look at France, Britain, United States, perhaps more questionably these days and more critically, but certainly France, Britain, Germany, Italy, leave alone China and India and Japan. Kagame's government gets an incredible review from the international system at the moment. That can be attributed back to 25 years ago, but since then, all these things that have happened, do you think that's changing at all? Or if it's not, what's driving it?
Well, not at all. I mean, it's almost quite the opposite. Kagame's Rwanda, continues to punch well above its weight, at least on the kind of regional perception index of state performances. it continues to project itself as a model government that is concerned about development, disciplined against corruption, and if there is the occasional human rights failing, then and this is how the story goes. Sometimes the people of this region need to be disciplined into getting over the developmental hump, to get to the kind of Canaan of prosperity on the other side. But Kagame's government looks good and projects itself in a very, very, very kind of effectively in that way against a situation in the region where cronyism and corruption are the generated narratives. Now,
and unlike places like
nobody, if I may just, nobody notices or points out that the RPF government, being what it is the biggest crony system in the region, and it's just being run out of the state. So that fact kind of, because again, we've also got to realize that there is the manner in which information circulates in this region is completely insufficient for a clear understanding of what's going on. It is for the ordinary thinking East African, knowing about what's going on on the other side of the kind of East African wood is extremely difficult. We just don't get there's just not enough information out there to make intelligent judgments about things. So that's a major factor.
Michela, and I'll maybe come back to you again on this one as well, Pastor. What triggered the internal opposition to Kagame, the ruling clique around the RPF? I mean, at what stage do you think Patrick just said, this isn't going to work? This guy's taking us in entirely the wrong way? Or was that the sort of thought process? Or was, if he can do it, I can do it, and I can do it a damn sight better. I'm smarter, I'm more charismatic, and actually I can just take over. What informed Patrick Karegeya's revolt against Kagame? And at what stage do you think it happened?
That's a very good question. I mean, he himself said that, the scales fell from his eyes, or at least he could no longer accept what was going on around 2000. And a lot of people will say
2000.
Yeah.
As in Congo or domestic?
He lists, this is when he applies for political asylum in the US. He lists a whole a set of reasons why he fell out with Kagame. Congo was one of them, but it's part of a bigger complaint. And actually the one he leads off with in his affidavit is something that many other people in the RPF will mention as a key moment. And it is when Pastor Bizimungu, the president of Rwanda, the Hutu president, the figurehead president, who really didn't hold any real power, but was nonetheless an important figurehead of ethnic reconciliation between the two communities, is basically shown the door by Kagame. And it becomes clear that Kagame no longer wants to simply be vice president. He also wants to be president and run everything. And I think for a lot of the inner circle of the RPF, that was the moment where they thought, okay, this is a massive power grab, and we should have been more prepared for this. We didn't necessarily see this coming. Johnny Carson, when I interviewed him, the US Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, he was saying that he thought Kagame had always been surrounded by a clique of people who thought they were just as good as he was, just as smart, and that their time would come around eventually. I don't think Patrick would have been one of those people, because I think he was always going to be a wheeler dealer, someone who liked to operate behind the scenes. I don't think he would ever have wanted to be a president himself. But I do think that as the time went by and the emergency, all those fears that they were about to be reinvaded by Hutu genocidaires in eastern Congo, that the government was fragile, they weren't going to make it, that the population wouldn't accept them. As those fears sort of subsided, I think he began to feel that the level of human rights repression wasn't acceptable, and the way in which power was being centralized in Kagame's hands was also really worrying. And he wasn't alone in that. But I think if you look at why these guys actually fled, in most cases, if you ask them to sort of talk you through, tell me how it was that you ended up crossing the river in your underpants, the river between Rwanda and Uganda as you fled into exile, because there have been so many who have followed that route. Most of them were afraid they were going to be killed, imminently, because you would, Kagame would make his displeasure known. You would be told that you had to apologize. You'd usually have been sort of sidelined or sacked by then. You'd be told you had to make a public apology. You would say, well, apologize for what? And they'd say, just apologize. And then maybe you would apologize or you'd refuse to apologize. And it just was never enough. You were sort of meant to bow down before the king and show total abnegation. And then someone would start calling you, and maybe it'd be a friend of a friend, an intelligence, and say, he's going to kill you now. That's what's coming next. You do know that's what's going to happen. And that had happened to so many people in the regime that no one doubted that was what was on the card. So I think very often there wasn't that much of a sort of principled stand prompting the flight. It was, I've got to get out of here because I'm going to die. And I think, that's why Patrick left. He had just been recently released from jail, and he was rung up by a general who said, you haven't said the right things. You haven't made the right kind of gestures of humility. You better get out now. And same thing happened to General Kayumba Nyamwasa in South Africa several years later. And I've heard that story from so many people now. And so, I think self-preservation was one of the key factors.
Right. What do you hear, Parsa, about that factor? And in terms of how well you've got these top figures in the regime, those that survive, get out of the country and then form this opposition movement, Rwandan National Congress and so on. Do you think anything was pre-planned, or is just, as Michela described it, it's just there's a growing unease, and then there's a fear for personal safety, and then they gap it and run across the river?
I'm just trying to recall to the news, which news narratives really played out over here, and obviously my memory will go right back to '96 and the murder of Seth Sendashonga, which happened right here. But when you read the stories of when you read the way those stories were consumed locally was very different from A, what the story was, and B, what kind of meta narrative around the post-genocide period was being constructed. Seth Sendashonga was treated as, okay, yes, this is an ex-Rwandan minister assassinated. It looks like there are some Rwandans in the hauled in, but there was only an echo rather than any kind of sense, rather than any kind of investment inside local media houses to begin chasing the story and building a story so that readers over here could begin to understand what actually was going on in Rwanda. Rwanda and the genocide and its bloody, chaotic aftermath in Zaire at the time was very much received to us via CNN and the wire services. We were basically just part of a global audience, rather than being concerned neighbors for whom who could not eat fish for months on end because of the horror of bodies floating into Lake Victoria down the Kagera River. I mean that. So you've got this kind of dissonance, where cognitive dissonance, where there is a felt and lived reality that is in no way being reflected either by your own media institutions and others, or by the unfolding narrative as it's playing out on Western media. So I don't know the extent to which I've gone in.
No, I think it's important. You've made an important point in terms of differentiating the reaction, because I think they are sharply different. We've got time for a couple more things. I mean, on my side, and Parsa, feel free, please, to throw questions at Michela yourself. But two things I wanted to ask. One thing about this cognitive dissonance. I think that's another category of political activists we should look at. But those who are suffering from cognitive dissonance or not, the academics, the journalists who have stayed with the Kagame project, there's a section in the book you talk about where the mechanics of doing the research and talking to people that will tell you stuff, even pretty mundane stuff, to the extent that Kagame is making all the economic figures up, or he's slicing and dicing them to make them look far better than they really are. But people being really reluctant to talk about this stuff and, absolutely refusing to go on the record as though their lives depended on it.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could say a little bit about how effective the propaganda regime from Kigali has been in reining in these people, not just Rwandan nationals, but foreign citizens, particularly Westerners, Brits, Americans, French, and so on.
I found that particularly disappointing, and actually it made me quite irritated and angry at one stage, because I could completely understand a Rwandan who has family back in Rwanda, or maybe, is passing through. I interview them when they're passing through the West, through Europe, and they're going back to a job, in Rwanda, that they don't want to go on the record. I mean, I'm delighted they're even speaking to me. I would be very wary as well in their shoes. But when you're talking to a Western academic who is, got a tenure at a university in the West, or a former ambassador, who used to be an ambassador somewhere in the Great Lakes, has extraordinary insights and sort of anecdotes to tell you, and really has a very clear and skeptical grasp of what is going on, or a statistician or an economist who really have sort of looked at this stuff closely, and they're saying the Rwandan success story is nothing like as impressive as it's made out to be. It's not disastrous. We're not talking about, Zaire under Mobutu or Equatorial Guinea, but it's nothing like the glowing kind of glossy image that is being portrayed. And they don't want to go on the record. And I did say to a couple of these people, I sort of said, this completely false image has now been broadcast and created, and you are an expert in the field, and you aren't willing to go on the record and challenge it. When this sort of Potemkin village finally collapses, your reputation will suffer. Doesn't that bother you? And a couple of them said, yes, it bothers me intensely, but I am not willing to put my neck on the line. And I think there was a combination. Some of them were claimed to be physically frightened. They had been told, to stay away from the region. Maybe they had been threatened, you'll never work in the Great Lakes again, or don't even think of coming back there. Right. I found that quite hard to sort of credit. But I actually think they weren't only afraid of the Rwandan government, they were afraid of their peers. In fact, I think they were more afraid of their peers. They're afraid of the reputational censure of being disbelieved, being challenged, being, denounced at some conference, or in some, having an academic paper turned down. And that for them was enough to keep them silent. And I did get quite upset about it, because I encountered that same phenomenon when I was writing my book about Mobutu, where people who are now, retired from the IMF and World Bank had known all the theft and corruption that was going on under Mobutu, and had not revealed it at the time, they kept it to themselves. They knew there was no point lending Mobutu any more money. It was going straight into his personal bank account. And they never said a word. And now, looking back, it's all very well. They sort of admit that they played their part in the destruction of what was then Zaire's economy because they let it happen and never challenged him. And I sort of feel, well, this is a new generation of academics and experts who also will bear responsibility for what is going on. And as I said, I think that their concern is not that they might be taken out on one dark night on a road in London. It is more that they just don't want to take on these very vociferous Western defenders of the regime. They don't want to be sitting in a TV studio, taking on Andrew Mitchell or Tony Blair or Claire Short in their day. It's just too much stress.
For our international listeners, Andrew Mitchell was a Conservative MP who attained the status of international development minister and was forced to resign after he was claimed that policemen had fitted him up by claiming that he'd used four-letter words against them outside Downing Street. But he's become a very enthusiastic defender of Paul Kagame, and Claire Short was also another British development minister.
And so was Tony Blair and Bill Clinton and Bill Gates. These are powerful men, and a lot of people don't want to be, taking them on in public.
If I may just add on that point.
Yeah, please. Questions. Yeah.
It seems to me that by the time you're getting down to the level of academics and fearful, even journalists and diplomats, too afraid to actually come out and challenge the orthodoxy. You're actually dealing with a situation. If one takes it from this construction of simple narratives, in the 1990s after the Cold War, what is happening in Rwanda now is hardly the first place that a kind of organized, shall we say, fake news campaign or fake reality campaign was done. I mean, Uganda next door, from the early 90s, was being touted as this success story, and it was, everybody was writing about it. The academics, the wire services, the media, and so on and so forth. And yet it was untrue. Uganda's economic performance by the mid-90s, according to the IMF's own figures, was woeful. It was actually worse than it had been during Obote's time. They were regressing, and yet the figures, were showing a massive economic growth, which was true. I mean, the growth was true, but of course, these figures were not being used truthfully in the sense of creating, telling the whole story about the fact that you were starting from a very small base. So obviously, if you're growing at 7%, 8%, whatever, it hardly means that you're actually improving in the way that is being projected. I'm trying to say that there was an organized. That these are organized campaigns. Uganda had it, Ethiopia had it, Rwanda is now, we can now contend with the fact that, this are these figures, is this projection of reality actually true, or what's actually going on the ground? And yet it has been very effective precisely because of the complicity of all kinds of other actors, including Western institutions and states.
Yeah. And I think you could say that probably Rwanda learnt from those previous examples you've given, Parselelo, and they just took it to an extra level. They had the RPF elite is incredibly well educated, often lots of experience in the West. So, what you see is the use of lobbying companies, PR consultants. We saw that just recently in the Paul Rusesabagina trial. Lots and lots of money spent on creating and maintaining an image. Lots of concern over social media, curating your social media presence, reaching out and targeting anyone who contradicts the narrative. And I'm not talking here about all the diaspora Rwandans who get persecuted, harassed, threatened, and sometimes attacked and killed by the regime. I'm just talking about the way in which any newspaper or any user of Twitter who will suddenly say something about Rwanda that's not complimentary will suddenly be astonished to discover themselves being tweeted by a bunch of anonymous trolls, who are obeying orders from Kigali. It's really very impressive. And of course, then you have the use of Israeli manufactured spyware, so that people who do raise their head above the parapet can be easily tracked. The use of the Rwandan embassies abroad to keep tabs on the diaspora and, possible troublesome journalists or commentators. So it's a very well-run operation.
May I ask Michela, why? Please. Why it is that it has been so thorough and so comprehensive and successful, diabolically successful? Why does the Rwandan state keep such close tabs? Globally, how was it able to create such a global surveillance system?
I think you have to look. I think you need to look at who Kagame was. He was a military intelligence expert. That's what he did, in the Bush and the NRM. That's what he then did when Museveni took power in 1986. He was working for the military information in Kampala. He then took all those skills, transferred them, to Kigali. All the key people that you ever hear sort of holding any important positions of power in Rwanda always seem to have a background of some sort in intelligence, military intelligence. This is what they're very good at. This is what they know how to do. It's a sort of obsessive interest. But this is, the very fact. I remember being told that Kagame monitored the radio of army radio. He was constantly monitoring it because he wanted to sort of see if he could catch out anyone who was saying disrespectful stuff. That's how you sort of notice if there's a military coup brewing, you catch it early. And then the fact that he's very present himself on Facebook and Twitter using all sorts of anonymous accounts, and then his use of an army of Twitter trolls. I think that's just part of who he is, his training, his instincts.
Maybe we should round up with just a sense of what's going to happen. I guess this book is going to create quite a stir. It does paint a pretty devastating picture of the regime in Kigali at the moment, although that's not its main purpose. Its main purpose is to tell us about who Patrick Karegeya is, what he did in his life, and how it ended as it did. But that does really give us incredible insights, I think, into what's going on in Kigali at the moment. I'm wondering whether you see any changes coming, or do you see any threats to this control of the narrative by the Kagame regime? Do you sense any skepticism on the other side of the Atlantic with Joe Biden's regime?
I think perceptions are changing. And I don't, I think my book will add to that trend, but I think that's already been happening. I sort of sense it. You can I think the Paul Rusesabagina trial has sort of surprised a lot of Americans. They had the most simple of simple narratives about Rwanda, and this hero, the hotel Rwanda manager, suddenly being arrested meant that they're now interested and open to sort of skeptical thoughts about Kagame that they probably weren't open to before. The Trump to Biden succession will also have implications. Biden's going to be more concerned about Kagame's human rights records. Trump never gave a damn about any aspect of Africa. I think there have been so many stories. Really, my book is a compilation of what's been out in the press mostly. I give it a personal face, but all these stories about Rwandan opposition people, journalists, activists being targeted and sometimes killed abroad. There are only so many of those that people can read without believing there's something very sinister about the regime in Kigali. Even if you discount half of them, you're going to end up thinking this is actually really quite grim and rather dark, and not by no means a benign regime. So I think perceptions are changing. That doesn't mean that it threatens Kagame in any real way, but he is going to be getting less aid from the British. The British are going to be cutting aid to Rwanda, as they're cutting aid to everybody. So he might feel the need to be less confrontational in his interactions. You know, if you look at all the presidents in the Great Lakes, the African presidents, they've always, you know, it's African agencies what gets rid of them. Usually invasions or a bullet in the back of the head from your own personal bodyguard. I think one of the worrying things with Kagame is like all these strong leaders, he has deliberately not prepared a succession because if you have a possible successor, he is also a threat. So he has deliberately not allowed anyone to present themselves as the person who would take over were something to happen to him. And that means that the future is very, very unclear. And we've seen the same phenomenon with Museveni and various other leaders. It was very interesting last year, about middle of last year, there were rumors, rife that Kagame had a brain tumor, had been evacuated for health treatment and emergency surgery in either London or Israel. And there was a very long silence in which he wasn't seen abroad. Perhaps that was because of COVID. Perhaps there was some sort of medical emergency. But I think that certainly got me thinking that things can change very, very quickly. I mean, we've seen the Burundian president suddenly dying of a heart attack. We've seen Magufuli has suddenly left the scene, someone who seemed likely to be around for a very long time. So I think the future remains unpredictable. And that's really one of the problems with Rwanda, is you sort of think if you have a setup in which one man is so domineering and so important, and your institutions, yes, you've set up these various institutions, that really, you're the man who micromanages everything about your country. When you go, it's very unclear what will happen.
Parselelo, any other closing thoughts on this incredible book? It's 450 pages, so a lot of thoughts there to have. And just what your sense is of the trajectory on which Rwanda is bound now. What might happen in the next few years?
I mean, about the book, I think the
couple of
I should say is the writing. There are passages in there where the writing is just exquisite. It is really captures a sense of place. Really, does the things good writing does with the characters, with a storyline. I mean, you can't put it down once you start. So, congratulations on that. Going to the question of legacy in the future, it's just occurred to me that the history of kind of African liberation in the kind of Great Lakes, East and Southern African regions, was disrupted right at the beginning with the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. And the creation of the first strawman in Mobutu Sese Seko, and for the next 32 years, this was the guy, and it became almost an industry to study his eccentricities and idiosyncrasies and so on, and his excesses, obviously. But I think the question of how he himself was able to stay on in power, was not simply a question of his kind of personal slyness, cleverness, and brutality. He was propped up. He was a strongman of the West. And I think the great irony of the mid-late 90s and Museveni, Kagame, and Laurent Kabila as well, going into the Congo as this kind of revolutionary front, going to unseat him, is that in many ways. At least some of us suspect that they were also doing work on behalf of other interests. As much as it suited, it was very much in their interest to get rid of Mobutu later on. They were propped up, and they remain propped up. So I think the question of how long either Museveni will last or how long Paul Kagame will last is very much a function of whose interest they continue to maintain in that region. Considering how utterly brutal and in Museveni's case at least, how utterly ridiculous he has become. Where you're calling elections that are clearly not elections, and yet you do so with impunity.
That's all for this week. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast, and a special thank you again to our guests, Michela Wrong and Parselelo Kantai. You can always catch our previous episodes and all our features online at theafricareport.com. Now, if you enjoy this podcast, do rate and review us on your favorite platform. For the Africa Report, this is Anne-Marie Basada. Thanks for listening.